welcome to Forward to the Past. In this episode we're going to be looking at alternate ways of heating your home, and we're looking back to the era of paraffin. And this example here I got off eBay a few years back for I believe £10–20, I can't remember exactly how much. Luckily they tend to go cheap because no one wants them. It's made by a company called Ripping Isles, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and it was made in England. So let's have a look at what this has. We're going to kind of take it apart. So the top comes up here, and this is where your fuel tank is, and this is made of glass, and we're going to come back to the fuel later on. This here is the instructions, which the very first time I went to light this, I read this several times because I didn't know how it worked. Obviously I don't read it anymore because I know how it works. So that was a very handy thing to have, because when mucking about with paraffin you do need to make sure you're doing it correctly. So we lift up the grill here, and there's another safety flap here, and it says paraffin pink down the bottom, which is something I don't think you get anymore. It's just standard paraffin. About that was kind of branding back then. You had paraffin blue, paraffin pink, blah blah blah. So this is the chimney where the main source of heat comes from. So we've got the mesh at the top, which literally glows red hot. We've got a catch here that just holds it all down neatly. So I take the mesh off, and we've got this spring which also glows red hot. And we've got a cap here which is for making sure you're directing the airflow correctly so it comes out sideways, because if you have it off you'd end up just having a huge flame, which would be incredibly dangerous and smoky. So turning it upside down, we've got these rings which are filled with all these holes, and this is basically for the paraffin and air mix to flow up there evenly so it burns and gives off the heat nice and evenly around and displaces it nicely. So this whole thing obviously becomes far too hot to touch when it's in action. So at the bottom, this is the wick. Now, unlike my other paraffin heaters, this wick doesn't wind up and down. This one just sits there. It could do with replacing because it's quite uneven. There's even a gap missing at the front. But believe it or not, we actually use this heater on a daily basis when the weather's cold, and it burns absolutely fine with the wick in its current condition, so I've never bothered to replace it. So let's have a look at the fueling method for this. So this, as I said earlier, is the glass tank, so you do not want to drop it. The reason it's on this handle, so it allows it to swing, is because when I put it in there, I actually have to turn it upside down to start the flow. So the top of the cap here has got this non-return valve, so when it's pushed down and the weight goes onto it, it opens the valve up. So then when you lift it up, it closes off, and in theory it will stop it dripping, but it does drip, but it won't leak everywhere. So let's have a look in here. Let's grab my 6-volt light. So down here is the reservoir where the paraffin goes. The glass container sits on the top here, and the metal nozzle, the non-return valve, touches the bottom there. So the paraffin will flow into the chamber, and it will not flow up too high. Once the paraffin has reached the top part of the chamber, it will cut off and it won't feed it. So if it were to overflow, the paraffin, there'd be too much and it'd be dangerous. So at the bottom here we've also got this little filter, which really doesn't really need a filter too much unless you're really putting in dirty paraffin, because it's not like it's pressurized and going in tiny jets, it's just going down a pipe. So I'll pop that back in. Oh, nice and flush, hopefully. Yeah. And there's a pipe at the bottom there that just runs down. And then if we come over to the front again, lift this up, you can see the pipe just at the bottom running into where the wick is. So that's how the paraffin is fed. So it's basically gravity fed to the bottom of the wick. And then the wick obviously soaks it up. One thing this heater has is this device here, but I don't use it because it's actually broken. Sometimes buying vintage equipment, things have worn out and they don't work. The reason it doesn't work is this nut here, the thread on the shaft actually needs re-threading, because it doesn't, well, you can turn it all day long, and although it doesn't come off when I pull it, it doesn't tighten and it gets jammed. But what its purpose is, it lives in this hole here, and it goes like this, and then to the side of the heater here is a knob which you can turn. And this device lives in the middle of the chimney. And what it does is you turn the knob on the side and it supposedly lifts up, but it's a bad design because it actually gets jammed. You have to lift it ever so slightly and then it will function as intended. So the idea was you could lift up the chimney, light it, and then just drop it down. But as I say, when it's at its lowest point, it jams because it's at the bottom, it's at a right angle, so it just doesn't work. But anyway, because it's broken, I don't use it. And I've actually found you don't really need it. It's an unnecessary device. And as I say, I've been using this heater for a couple of years now without it, and it's been fine. So, but I thought I'd better put that in there just so I don't miss anything out. So we're going to reassemble the chimney, which is very simple. Put the cap on, put the spring on, put the mesh on, and the cap. And there's little locating lugs around which just hold it on. Put it on like this, push it down, and then hopefully turn it a bit, and it doesn't, I mean, as you see, it's all very loose, but it's not going to move around once it's sitting there. So I'll just locate that back on there. When you stick it on, you've got to do this quite quick when it's actually lit, because it gets hot surprisingly quickly. It sits nice and flush, you can turn it, and you can rock it, and the whole thing with the wick, it will move. And if it does that, you know it's actually sitting flush, and it's safe to leave. Because if it's kind of ajar like that, it means the flames are all going to come out at the wrong angle and be pretty nasty if something goes wrong. So stick that in. Now around the side there's an interesting device here. This is actually a dial for high and low. So at the moment it's at its highest, and then you can turn it to the middle for medium or turn it down here for low. As I said earlier, because this heater doesn't have a wick that you wind, all this is, if I lift it out, it just interrupts the flow. So as I turn it, you see here it's thicker, and then it's kind of got a high and low point. So when you turn it on here, it's got a locator, so it moves it up and down. So obviously the higher it moves, a bit like inside a carburettor with the airflow of petrol, as it moves up, it allows more paraffin to come through, so it will burn hotter. And then you wind it down like that, and of course it restricts the flow. And then this spring here you can pump, and that just helps to prime it, although I don't actually use the primer because it doesn't seem to need it. So anyway, I'll pop that back in and I'll sit it at the highest point, so around here, so it has the maximum flow. So now we're going to look at the fuel going in and out. So what we have to do is stick it upside down. Something to take note of is this bit here that holds the metal band on. If you're putting it down, it sometimes gets stuck like that. So when you put it down, you've got to make sure it's to the side like this, so the glass container goes to the bottom. So anyway, you need to flip it upside down, and this has to be done fairly carefully because although the non-return valve is there, it will always leak a little bit. So stick it upside down. It's beginning to drip, but into the chamber, and then sit it down flush, and you'll see it bubble, hopefully. You see the paraffin bubbling. That is because it is currently filling up the chamber at the bottom. And then once this is upside down, you leave it upside down, and it will just slowly trickle feed the wick. And then to lift it out, this is why it's got that hinge, is all I do is I lift it up, and the weight, it will automatically flip up the correct way. Now this may seem a little bit dodgy because you might have seen a bit of paraffin falling out, and I have actually had a drop of paraffin falling onto there, but all it does go, and it's fine. If you have any kind of thoughts that this is dangerous and volatile, watch my paraffin and petrol video and you'll discover that paraffin isn't quite as volatile as you might expect. So anyway, I think it's probably time to light it. So the paraffin fuel tank is upside down at the moment, so it's feeding the wick. As you can see, the wick now is actually very wet. That means it's all soaked up and nice. So I'm going to light the match, and I do 12, 6, 3 and 9 o'clock to make sure it lights evenly all the way around. So start at the one at the back so you don't burn your hand, and work your way forward. So there you go, the wick is now lit, and I wait for it all to connect round, and then I'll very quickly but carefully stick the chimney on, make sure it's flush. Takes a bit of technique. So that's flush, and that will get hot very quickly. So I can close that, the dial is turned up to top, and it's now going to heat up. So we're going to leave it and come back when it's at full working temperature. been about 10 to 15 minutes and the heater now is at full optimum temperature. I must admit it's actually uncomfortable standing this close to it because it's like standing next to a fireplace, which is, I guess, its intended purpose. Because of the light in here, you can't see, although it is glowing, when you're in a darker room, it's literally, it throws out quite a lot of red light. So there's just a couple of things I'm going to say about it now that it's actually lit. First of all, behind the chimney is the light metal in the concave shaped bit of metal there, and that is basically there to project the heat outwards. So rather than it just going up, if I put my hand here, it's warm, but if I move it further away, it's actually hotter here. In fact, that's uncomfortably hot. If you were to hold a bit of toast right up against here, it would actually toast it. So this thing is not just a kind of heat up a room a little bit, you will get decent heat off of it. So I was going to say about paraffin and having it so close to the heat here. This part where the instructions are, there's a divider, and that, even if I put my hand in here, it's not particularly hot, and in here it's just cold, and the paraffin tank is nice and cold. Because if that were to heat up, if there was no division and nothing protecting it, if it was to heat up the paraffin, it could become volatile, which of course would be very dangerous. So anyway, I'm now going to turn it off, and you can't blow these out. You could blow as hard as you want, you will not blow it out. So we basically lift up the tank, flip up the other way, and then I can actually just put it back in this way up, like that, and it's going to sit on top of the reservoir. It's not going to do any harm, and I can close the flap at the top and then leave it. Now, there, obviously you can see it's still actually lit. It's not just going to go poof and go out. It takes about 15 minutes. So as there is still paraffin in the reservoir and it's still feeding it, it takes about 15 minutes. It will get progressively dimmer and eventually it will go out on its own accord. So let's talk about the pros and cons about using paraffin heaters, not just specifically this one, but paraffin heaters in general. So the good side to them, they are fairly cheap to run. This one is actually the most uneconomic on paraffin consumption, but then again it also gives off the most heat. That's out of the paraffin heaters I have in my collection. So this one is the best if you want to heat up a room quickly. So as you can see, they are pretty much instant heat the second you light them, although this one takes a while to get up to full temperature, but straight away you get heat off the bat, unlike a coal fire or wood fire in an open or a wood burning stove, that kind of thing. But of course the downside to them, apart from the safety thing about having paraffin and naked flames in the home, is of course the gas that they give off, which is carbon monoxide, which is very bad for you. To be fair, your candles that you light at dinner also give off carbon monoxide, but on a much smaller scale. I've heard stories of people in the past using paraffin heaters in their bedrooms at night, and they've closed their window and they've actually died during the night due to asphyxiation from the gas. So if you are using them, you need to have a window open and a bit of a draft or ventilation just to keep the gas moving out, because it is very dangerous. The other thing is only use them for short amount of times. Don't leave them on for hours and hours on end, because they will fill the room up with gas, which is particularly bad for us, and it is also very bad for your pets. So the reason why people don't really use paraffin heaters now, similar to kind of the old gas heaters, is the gas, the fumes that they give off. But overall, they're quite fun to use. They're very interesting, providing you use them safely. There is a practical purpose to them. As I say, we use this every day when it's cold in the winter and stuff. So yeah, so it's a good old thing really. I'm glad I got it for that bargain on eBay. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time.